Scott and I were at this Copenhagen event a few weeks ago, the TM Forum event. There was a panel session in the morning, and the AT&T CTO was on it, Jeremy Legg, and he came out with this interesting comment about how we've moved to this all-you-can-eat world. It's good stifling of a sneeze.
No, probably do me damage.
Aneurysm.
But he came out with this comment, we've moved to this all-you-can-eat world, and maybe we need to start thinking, I don't know how he said it exactly, I did write the quote down, but maybe we need to start thinking about usage-based tariffs. And I'm pretty sure he wasn't meaning metering, but a more intelligent way of pricing for data consumption. But if we enter a situation where everybody's basically not using any more and it's plateaued or it's going down, then that doesn't look like a...
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, recorded quite early in the week this week. Yet again, it's Pierre's fault, because you're going off somewhere, aren't you, mate?
Yes, this time it is.
But it also does coincide with us having a curry of Nokia later. So that's it. We like to kill two birds with one stone when we arrive. Again, I won't bury the fact that we've got a guest. Welcome back. I think last time did we say that you're the most returning guest? It's either you or Mary Clark, but it's William Webb. I don't know, I'm just going to call you telecoms industry veteran. Is that
sounds good to me? Thanks, Scott.
And among other things you've done is you've been at Ofcom and you've been at like, what was it? There was a wireless standard.
Yeah, so I co-founded a startup in the IoT space called Newell, which then led to a standard called Waitlist, which is like an IoT standard, and I ran that for a while.
And you've recently been being a consultant somewhere else, but now you're going back to just being William Webb consultant.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever, however you brand yourself.
Yeah, independent consultant.
Okay, but
hides many sins.
But the real reason, apart from the fact that it's always great to have you on, but the real reason we get on is that you're a bit of a prolific author these days. I think every time we get you on, you've whacked another book out.
Yeah, this one was a mistake actually.
I mean, self-publishing helps, doesn't it?
Yeah. I wrote it as a paper, and I thought it was quite consequential. So I sent it to a few people saying, where do you think I should publish this so that it gets the biggest hit? And they all came back and said, well, actually, you should write a book on it rather than a paper because it's consequential enough to need that.
But you get things like that happening. Like there's one famous example. It's not in our space. But there's a book that's written by an American social psychologist called The Coddling of the American Mind, which basically looks at how the way kids are being brought up, and especially the university system, is making people adverse to proper discussions and fielding positions at great odds to their own. And that started as a little paper and ended up being a best-selling book. So there we are. Fingers crossed.
Excellent.
Okay, well, we'll get back onto that in a sec.
Ian on the...
Yeah. What, saying that Ian's here?
Yeah.
I never say Ian's here. I figure
he doesn't. No,
I figure he's just priced in.
I'm just sort of in the background.
I was thinking about it the other day. All the sort of initial furniture has just been phased out.
You might have had to say Ian's not here today.
I know. I mean, I should. Obviously, if I was more disciplined, I'd say, and as ever, I'm delighted to be joined by co-host Ian Morris from Light Reading. Yeah. Give Light Reading its proper dues, which I don't do, so that's my bad.
I was thinking if I got here late, I could just sort of burst through the door and see a Monty Python sketch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like me and William just looking all bored and directionless, and then you suddenly turn up and bring some spice and expertise to the situation.
The train wasn't burning as much as they said.
No, you got in on the late side just because your tube was being a dick, but it was all right in the end.
Yeah.
So before we get into talking about William's book, have we been up to anything since the last pod? And we haven't had that much time to do anything, have we?
A couple of days, isn't it?
Yeah, because that was a Friday. So we went out. That was really nice. It was a really hot day. So we went out, had a beer with Ed, who was our guest. Also met up with a PR mate of mine called Katie. And it's good to catch up with her. And it's just good. It was like a proper summer beer garden till closing time sesh.
Were we there till closing time?
Something like that, I think. You know us. So, yes. But no, there's not that much other bollocks to talk about, is there?
All right.
So we'll just get straight into it.
So
before like, yes.
before shall I just invent some? Well, I had quite a nice dinner.
I watched a nice movie last night.
Yeah. Actually, I did.
Oh no.
What movie did you watch?
The Batman.
Yeah, it's all right.
It's all right.
That's the Robin Pattinson one, is it?
Robert
Pattinson.
Whatever.
Yeah. I think it got a very brief review. Sorry, very brief review. I like the look and feel of it. It's more like sort of Watchmen, proper old school DC comics, as opposed to sort of shiny armor and super gadgets. But the plotting's a bit linear and a bit stripped down.
I'm put off watching it because I like the Christopher Nolan ones.
Right.
with
It's too
Christian
soon.
Bale.
Yeah.
They've done so
Those
many.
were really good.
How many
And they were
Batmen
recent,
have
yeah.
been done?
I mean, there's been 3 major franchises. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're not counting the 60s.
But I think this was a good effort, and they've got one baddie in it who's based on the Penguin. I won't.
Colin Farrell, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say I won't spoil it.
Yeah, did you watch it because I talked about it last week? I showed it to you.
Maybe subliminally, it was just sat in my head.
Yeah. Great makeup.
Yeah. Well, that was the makeup. So actually, I'd forgotten that you'd said that. But I was like, God damn, that's Colin Farrell. He looks more like a sort of fat, scarred up Robert De Niro to me.
Yeah.
With the makeup on.
I've been watching that Ancient Roman series.
Is that
with
good?
Anthony Hopkins.
Oh, is that got For Those About to Die?
Those
that
About
it?
to Die is called, yeah. It's got the
Or
guy
is
who
this
was...
big AC/DC?
The main guy, you said, the guy who plays Ramsay Bolton in Game of Thrones. Can't remember the actor's name. He's really good in it. And yeah, it's good, actually.
You recommend it?
It's good.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
It's good.
All right, okay.
It's got mixed reviews, but I thought it was really good. Maybe my expectations were low, so...
Well, now my expectations are high, so thanks.
Okay.
All right, let's get into it. I'll do that. This is William Webb's new book called The End of Telecoms History.
Actually, can you, William, for the thumbnail, can you hold it?
Okay, yeah, you do it.
Look at the camera. That way.
Sure.
Cheers. Perfect.
He's got his best used car salesman shit in there. I'll hand it straight over to you. Why don't you give us, instead of me just reading out the back of the book, give us the elevator pitch and also tell us a bit about the cover image when you get round to it.
Yeah, sure. So the elevator pitch is that pretty much for the whole of telecoms history, engineers and networks have been trying to catch up with what users want, trying to deliver faster and faster speeds, going from sort of dial-up modems and so on, trying to get to the speeds that people actually want.
Sort of speeds and feeds arms race.
And trying to deliver ever more capacity as data growth has sort of absolutely spiraled. And that's kind of what we see telecoms as almost. It's what we've been doing for the last 30 years, if not the last 100 years, if you look at trying to catch up on voice. And yet my thesis is that's all come to an end. We've actually got more than enough speed. We don't need to go any faster.
Yeah.
And we've got more than enough capacity because we're not generating much more growth in data usage.
Yeah.
So actually, we can stop all that. The whole industry that's geared up to faster, bigger, better can just give up on that thesis. Now, there's other things it could do, but it's a real turning point in industry history.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on and what you're, what's implicit in what you're saying. I mean, to a certain extent, and this isn't in any way to diminish your observations, because I'm sure we'll get onto, you've been calling trends quite early for a long time. But I think the industry's kind of realised what you're saying because, as we said in the pod last week, they haven't been able to charge anymore, certainly to consumers, for 5G. And yeah, just that simple, I don't know, dumb pipe model of just providing ever more sort of telecoms speed and capacity and all that sort of thing has obviously peaked in terms of your ability to get a return on that. So they have got to think of some other stuff. I've just got to mute my phone.
They have. And I think the tide is now turning. I think for quite a long time, and still with some people, they're still, I would say, deluding themselves that there's something around the corner that will cause this to change. So some of the discussion that's sort of followed on LinkedIn and so on from me publishing the book has been, well, yes, okay, it is all slowing down, but there'll be something in the next few years that'll turn it all around. Things will pick up
well,
again.
there's always that, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think for a long time, many people were still pinning their hats to that. And I think slowly now that's changing, and more and more people are perhaps saying, yeah, perhaps there isn't anything else. Perhaps we do need to restructure or rethink about things in order to align with that.
I think you should explain because I read a chapter like before you'd finished it, which you kindly sent me when we met at an event a few weeks ago, and it had a really good explanation of the kind of rationale why there's an upper ceiling on what you think data usage can be, but you'd probably be better to describe it than I would.
Of course, yeah. So if you look at data usage, it's around about 80% video, roughly, and that's true both in fixed and mobile.
And that's partly just because it's just incredibly data intensive in itself.
Correct.
So it's not just a measure of how much people are using it, but when they use it, it has a disproportionate effect on the network.
So typical web browsing generates about 5% of the data volume for the same amount of time as watching video. So if you spent an hour browsing the web, you'd essentially be consuming 1/20th of an hour of video.
Yeah.
So nothing much apart from video really generates that much traffic. And if you look at how much video we can consume, it's 24 hours a day, but clearly not that much really. And so there's an upper limit of how much video you can watch. And that's and within that bucket, that's not just watching TV. It's YouTube. It's also video feeds that come up in your Facebook
or
feed or all that other kind of stuff.
And compression is getting better as well.
And that's an interesting point. So actually, when I wrote 5G Myth back in 2016, as part of the research, I just went to Netflix page on expected video rate or what they think of as required data rates for various video. And at the time, they said that for high definition, it was 5 megabits a second, and for 4K, it was 25 megabits a second. When I was writing this book, I just went back and revisited it to see if it had changed. And it has. It's gone from 5 to 3 megabits a second for high definition and 25 down to 15 for 4K. So it's about
like 3/5.
Yeah, exactly right. It's 3/5. So actually,
you going 5 to 3 and doing the maths. Yeah. Pretty sharp, eh?
You're good. I can see why you do maths in prisons.
Yeah. So
it's about my level.
So there's like a natural ceiling, and that ceiling could come down even as compression gets better. And when you then say, well, okay, could there be a new application? You have to look at it in terms of, so how much equivalent video does it generate? So if you look at some IoT stuff that sends a few messages and you ask, well, what's that in terms of video equivalence? It's like 3 seconds a day. It's a tiny, tiny amount. Yeah. To actually move that dial and to go back to growth, you need to essentially be delivering something that's equivalent to 2 or 3 hours of video to every handset every day.
Or you just HD it up, and one of the problems with that is the natural maximum resolution of small screens in terms of what's discernible to the human eye.
It is already HD'd up anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, but like
screens, but it's not.
Couch to TV, 4K. Beyond 4K, you don't really see any difference.
Yeah, it depends on what screen you're on, I guess.
And that's
but you don't need. But 4K on a phone's a fucking waste of time.
But you could be talking about broadband. I mean, this is
and there's certainly some element of oversupplying video to handsets. So
is your observation about just mobile networks or all networks?
All networks, actually.
Okay. Yeah, sorry,
fixed and mobile. You need to really worry about even less, don't you? Because the big fiber networks like XGS and whatever, it's like, don't worry about it ever again.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter. But I mean, there was an interesting announcement from I think it was Vodafone and Meta in the last couple of weeks.
I did see that and didn't write anything on it.
Yeah. That basically they said that they'd agreed that they would reduce the overall data flows, and I suspect that's mostly, to Pierre's point, compression of video, and perhaps a bit less prefetching and other things like that sometimes pulls down data that you don't actually need. But if that kind of thing happens as well, we could actually be seeing data reductions potentially. Now that's
you've basically got, once you've got everybody who's got a smartphone, which we pretty much all do. Anybody who's even toddlers have got them these days, it seems.
Yeah,
and they're all watching a lot of video each day. There's nowhere else to go. There's nowhere else to go. I mean, some people, I guess, would say, well, if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when ADSL was sort of coming along and 3G was just about there, maybe people didn't envisage some of the apps that we have now that are much more data hungry. Yeah. Could that happen again? Could things like AI and some of this other stuff kind of throw up applications that are, consuming even more than high definition video?
Absolutely. So I think there's two answers to that. One is people did envision what we're doing today, or at least he says blowing his own trumpet yet again. I did. So back in 2000, I wrote a book called the Future of Wireless Communications, and I set out my scenario of 2020. What's the world going to look like in 2020? What are we going to be doing? And actually, I got it pretty much right. I over-predicted slightly on some of the kind of Siri type stuff, but by and large, pretty much right. Now I didn't predict that in 2007 an iPhone would emerge, but I did say that by 2020 we would be finding out where our nearest Starbucks was from our phone, pre-ordering our coffee, paying for it with our phone. So I was predicting what we'd be using it for.
Like a life remote control sort of thing, which is exactly what it's turned into.
So first of all, I'll push back and say, the last 20 years, I think, has been predictable. There hasn't been anything that's emerged in the last 20 years that's dramatically changed any of the forecasts that I've been making, at least. So to sort of say, there's stuff bound to happen that we haven't forecast, not sure that's true.
Yeah.
And then if you dig into each of the things that people put forward for 5G and 6G and so on, none of them stack up in terms of generating enough data to move the needle. Right. So, things like AI, I mean, yes, it might generate some more traffic, but it's not going to be a lot more traffic unless it delivers hours more of video somehow.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine why it would do that.
An AI-generated video isn't necessarily more data hungry than ordinary video.
Actually,
Exactly.
I've seen most of the stuff that they generate is 1080p because it's
I don't know what that means.
right now. I mean,
1080p is like HD.
HD, yeah. Sorry.
Oh.
And then, but eventually it'll probably get to 4K. But right now, I guess it's too much power to be worth it. But wait, I have another question. Netflix announced that they have 80 games in development and that they'll release one per month starting next month, whatever. Do we know how much data like Netflix gaming does? Is that more than video?
That would have been one to ask Ed last week. And without
I know, yeah.
stealing your thunder.
Yeah. So I mean, gaming depends to the extent that it's rendered locally versus it's cloud rendered. So a lot of gaming, essentially, you download the game itself, and then by and large it does all the rendering locally, and it just sends back. And if you're playing a multiplayer game, it's just sending to the cloud your position and that kind of thing, where the other players are. So the data volumes, once you've had the download, are very small.
That's more of a latency thing rather than.
But Netflix, do you download the game with Netflix?
So there are, I don't know about the Netflix games, there are some games that run entirely on the cloud, and then they just send the video as a video stream to you as a user.
Well, they tried that. I mean, Google tried it, didn't they? Stadia.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, that relies on very stable networks and often doesn't work as well. But even if it did, it's just video.
It's video.
So assuming that you're gaming rather than watching, it's still
you're just
video.
replacing one thing with another thing.
One video with another thing. Yeah.
And how many people? How many people game seriously on their phones? I mean, there's casual games like I was dicking about on one while listening to a podcast and I was getting the train down. But not proper full-on games.
I think the mistake that a lot of people make, though, is to assume, because they go, but there's new AI applications coming on, and they talk about it as though the user's using them at the same time, as though you're there's this assumption that, they're using all these new applications and they're all running simultaneously. Of course, you're not. If you're not watching a BBC iPlayer thing of David Attenborough wandering around, you're doing something on AI that might be less data hungry.
Exactly.
So one just replaces the other anyway.
Yeah.
By the way, quickly, I just Googled Netflix gaming. And for some reason, the Netflix Help Center link, I'm getting this site can't be reached.
Well, that says a lot about their gaming.
Do you know what I mean?
Right now.
But just seeing on the preview that comes up on Google, before I click through, it says after a game is installed, you can then open it, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So that's them saying
so
you still install it locally. It's not pure cloud gaming.
Yeah.
So it's not. I thought because it'd be within the app or something.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know if, because the VR stuff is obviously crazy amount of rendering and it's more than 4K. If they ever do cloud VR, which that would be insane amount of data. So you'd have a small headset that doesn't need such power, and then it would feed you via Wi-Fi, I guess. I don't know.
And there has been discussion about that in the past, but for various reasons, I think manufacturers have just never gone there because, again, it requires very stable networks and very, very low latency. I think you're particularly sensitive with a VR headset to the latency.
So the Vision Pro, which we talked about before, and I get all the, it's probably not going to be used outside fixed settings anyway, but there was some photo that someone put up on LinkedIn this week of a guy sitting on a train with one on.
Yeah.
And,
tethered,
and someone had taken a picture and he's obviously on a mobile connection, I'm guessing, or even if it's the back, even if he's using train Wi-Fi, which he probably isn't because that's hopeless, isn't it?
Yeah, but, good luck with that.
Yeah.
But, the kind of VR stuff that you were able to do on that, if people were using them in, mobile environments, cafes, but not logging onto Wi-Fi and trying to do it over 5G, is that a kind of...
I mean, it depends what they're doing. So if you're doing a Teams call or whatever, again, that's probably just replacing doing a Teams call on your laptop, and it probably isn't changing the bandwidth particularly. So sort of substitutional. Yeah. I've heard that things like this, it's a great way to watch movies on an airplane, but then you've got to download that in advance, and you're watching. Okay. So it's not clear that they'll generate much, but also that the headset volumes are just tiny and going down rather than up. So it's still less than 1% of the population have actually own a VR headset.
But the actual games that you would play I'd play one at a friend's house on a what's the Facebook, the Meta sort of
Oculus,
where you're in a climbing game.
I've got that.
Yeah, and it's quite. I was surprised how sort of real it seems in a way.
It's quite scary when you look down.
And you look down, and my friend's like, you need to jump across that bit, and you feel yourself like not wanting to do it. But
that's entirely rendered locally.
That's rendered locally. Okay,
you could run that without any broadband connection at all, I think.
But if you tried to do that over the air, would something like that, would that kind of 3D VR effect be a big kind of boost to the kind of traffic that's coming down the pipe compared with high definition TV or something?
The latency is
not that much.
Yeah, it's more latency.
Yeah. It depends to some degree on exactly what resolution and how much preloading you do in case you suddenly want to look in a different direction and so on. And there have been, in the past, there have been people saying, "Oh, you need gigabits to do this properly."
Right.
But whether you'd actually ever do it properly, I don't know. But I think actually that whole market is just not one that's really taken off at any speed.
No, I was just going to say those taking a step back, those VR headsets anyway. I mean, nobody's talking about them replacing smartphones in the short term as the main device that you carry around and do your day-to-day stuff on. So the 5G networks that are set up today and for the next few years, even if we were being sympathetic towards arguments about VR headsets, they're just not going to be here en masse, I don't think.
No, exactly.
For a long time, as something that replaces the main form factor that we have today.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something, Chris?
Yeah, it's just... So I stopped playing video games when I was about 18.
I wish I could say the same.
Yeah. And back in the day, it fit on a DVD, you had the game, one CD, whatever. But now I see my nephews, they download the game on the PS5 and it's minimum 80 gigs for a decent game, 100 and plus, because it's got all these
they basically have to set up the download overnight, don't they?
But still, you're talking about, 80 gigs is more than I probably use per month altogether. And and then when they don't want it anymore, they delete it and then they re-download it again. So all of a sudden you get these hundreds of gigs.
But again, like sort of two things to steer it back to the sort of theme of William's book. So firstly, we've sort of spent the last 10 or 15 minutes stress testing, coming up with possible reasons why you might be wrong. And I think none of them really pan out. But then the other one is just that important distinction. That's why I asked you about fixed and mobile. Obviously, no one's downloading an 80 gig game over a mobile network.
No.
So they're just distinct things. And I mean, I guess...
Well, most people watch Netflix on Wi-Fi.
Well, quite. So a lot of these things. So I think it's really important when we're talking about these things, and I'm saying this for you to agree or correct me if you don't, to talk about mobile... what?
Do you want
No, I just started a star, haven't I, mate?
But William said that they can charge more now. They can charge more. They cannot charge more anymore. But I'm thinking if you need an 80 gig game quickly, you're going to want a very fast connection, and that's going to cost more than a slower one.
Yeah, well, so maybe we'll come to this, but I think that fixed and mobile are distinct things. The reason why it tends to come up more in mobile, and I think we might have chatted about this last time we had William on, and I think we chatted about it last week with Ed, is a lot of the premise for the presumed growth, both in revenues for operators and in revenues for their big vendors like Ericsson and Nokia, is that this mobile, specifically mobile consumption, is going to keep going up. And to stop you feeling self-conscious about self-promoting, you called this S-curve a long time ago. And the S-curve, and this S-curve, for people who haven't heard us bang on about this before, is basically like a simple graph where we've got time along the x-axis and we've got total global sort of mobile data consumption on the y-axis. And the S-curve, we've been in an exponential phase for a while for the things that we were just detailing, video, but we're coming to the top of that S-curve where it's leveling off. So I think that sort of steers us back to your sort of central premise of the end of telecoms history. Certainly on mobile, data traffic is no longer a primary business case, the growth in data traffic. I mean, I would argue that has that not been the case for a while with fixed, and perhaps they're showing mobile how to sort of pivot away from that. But I'm putting words in your mouth. But just give us some thoughts. If we're at the top of that S curve and traffic is no longer a key business driver, then where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you don't necessarily need to go anywhere. Is the interesting answer. And people initially think, "Gosh, this is terrible news." Actually, if you're a mobile operator, it's great news. You don't need to invest any more money in building more network capacity. So you can
not such good news for Ericsson.
No. So as an operator, you can reduce your capex, but the consumers are still going to carry on wanting to use your services, and you can still charge them just as much. Now, perhaps competition will reduce that, but in principle, at least for a short time, it's good news for the operators.
Yeah, I don't see it's got any kind of negative connotations for the operators because they've never monetized traffic growth anyway.
No.
That's been the problem.
It's been the problem.
And no one would suggest that they do a taxes and a metering system, but they could have been cleverer about the way they charge.
They're still semi-metered in so much as
it's very
you'll pay a bit more for an allowance.
Very poorly though. Yeah, you're talking about people now being able to get sort of allowances of 20, 30 gigabytes.
And you never get anywhere near them.
No one's even close to using unless you're uploading loads of skateboarding videos on the upper deck of a bus on your way back from the skate park. Then
you know me
never
too
even
well.
Close to. Yeah, like you do all the time. But unless you're doing things like that every day, you're not even close to doing it. So they've never really done a very good job, and that's their problem for them in a way. That's this whole fair share nonsense because they haven't monetized their networks very well.
They're trying to find other sources.
They're trying to find other sources.
Easy
but
wedge.
It's bad for the. I mean, where I think your stuff's really compelling is, first that you came out with it a long time ago in the 5G myth, but not just being nice to you, but the whole Ericsson Nokia story over the last
funny
year,
if we spent the whole pod telling him our shit
has been people aren't spending money on networks basically. Now the explanation in North America was they built up a lot of inventory after the pandemic. You get that, and therefore they've cut capex because they're just sort of running down stock. But that wasn't the factor everywhere else. It was just that they're not as inclined, and you've got other factors in Europe like no one really wants to spend money on networks anyway because they haven't got any money. But they keep coming out with this story that eventually they'll have to spend, and nobody is. And Analysis Mason came out with a really, really gloomy report.
I saw that.
The one that Rupert Wood did, where they basically went, capex is now, we're in a new normal where it's going to be like below 15% or something. And it's been much higher than that in the past. Capital intensity is going to be at this new low rate, and there's not going to be a replacement cycle, basically. And I remember people at the event that we were at when you sent me the chapter of this book saying it might get to the stage now where they just start to sweat some of these assets for 15, 20 years rather than 7 to 10 years as they have done. Yeah,
no, that's my take that there won't be a new replacement cycle or like a 5G cycle. There isn't. We're not seeing much coverage expansion.
Are we calling bullshit on 6G now?
I mean, it's really hard to see how it can be useful.
Yeah, how it can be anything other than a marketing gimmick.
It's a super tanker that's already left and is cruising out into the ocean. So something I suspect will turn up called 6G. But it's
more than just a logo and a.
But all the build up to it's been quite
muted,
desperate and muted. Yeah. People saying things like, for a start, geopolitics might mean we don't even have a standard now. And we go back to the days when
single
China
global
was doing
standard,
things like TD-SC, DMA and all this. And secondly, you've got people like the NGMN going, we just want something that's software upgradable and maybe useful in certain areas. And then people are talking about things like sensing and reflective bendy surface, whatever it's called. The ones that
the 6G hexagon.
Reflective intelligent surfaces.
Reflective intelligent surfaces. I mean, that's not really a user use case, though, is it? Anyway, even if
let's coat every single building in this shit. That won't cost much.
No, exactly. I mean, really bonkers idea. Absolutely. But I agree with you. There does seem to be less discussion of 6G. If you go back 2 or 3 years, everyone was rushing to set up the 6G research centre that was going to be the world's centre. And those centres did get set up, but it's all gone a bit more muted since then, as if people are sort of pulling back slightly from that rhetoric. But even so, there's still a lot of momentum behind something happening.
Yeah.
So sorry, I interrupted you with that. You were just sort of talking about how we got to a stage where we're not going to have these predictable upgrade cycles that we had.
So there will be a replacement. So every base station is going to get obsolete or rust at some point.
Yeah.
And the question then is, how long is that? Is it 7 to 10 years? I suspect it's already more than that, probably for many base stations, probably more like 15 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So every 15 years, every base station in the world has got to be replaced. That's still a pretty big market. It's just smaller than the current market. So you'd anticipate the equipment market to drop for a few years and then to plateau out at some kind of replacement.
And the likes of Ericsson, Nokia, as Ian covers so well, have been downsizing extensively for a while.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, this goes back to the Huawei swap out stuff, because I hate to bring him up again.
Howard.
No, John.
Not John.
When John makes his arguments about...
We'll get messages.
I know we will, but when John's made his good arguments, I would say, by the way, about... operators complaining they have to replace Huawei equipment with Ericsson and Nokia. He's always made this, I think, very valid point that the equipment depreciates and eventually you'd have to replace it anyway.
Yeah.
And a lot of the 4G stuff, when they started talking about these bands, was probably due for replacement. But it sounds to me like they might have gone, even with 4G to some extent, well, we've depreciated it, but it's still actually in very good condition, and we could just leave it in there for a few more years.
You don't need to replace something just because it's depreciated.
Totally.
That's purely an accounting convention. Yeah. You replace it when it's finally stopped working well.
Yeah, when there's birds nesting in it.
I mean, it's like,
other stuff.
you might depreciate your car over 5 years, but it's still working just fine, so you keep it for another 5.
Yeah.
And I'm sure operators will increasingly do that. They'll just say, actually, we can push this out a bit longer. We can, most of it's working just fine. Or, we can just add a bit more memory to one of these cards and make it last a bit longer.
What do you think moving beyond the kind of this gloomy picture, does that mean we're in a situation where the Ericsson and the Nokias are going to really struggle to make any money, and telcos themselves
they just got to resize themselves?
Yeah, I think they'll be just fine, because there will be this constant need.
Shareholders who bought their shares about 5 years ago, not so happy.
Yeah, so they'll plateau out at some level, and I find it. I can't find any way to easily predict that. So I mean, maybe the analysis stuff is right. It looks plausible to me.
Yeah,
they'll plateau out at, I think that was saying what it would be like 2/3 of current sales levels or something like that. But at that point, the competition is still the same in the marketplace for that. People still need their product. So you'd imagine that they could make a decent return on selling into that space. It's unlikely we'll see many new entrants because it's not going to be an attractive market particularly. All the O-RAN suppliers seem to be fading away, at least the smaller ones.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that they would be just fine, but at a level probably 2/3 of the size of their current size or something like that, or at least 2/3 of their peak size. They've already come down a bit from that size. I don't think any of this is a gloomy picture. In fact, actually, I think
it's just only gloomy if you're obsessed with incremental growth the whole time.
I mean, I think actually we should be delighted. We've done it. We've got to a point where people who are well connected have got all of the connectivity they need. That's a great achievement.
And as you say, I was just skimming some of your contents to tee up some more questions. But obviously, you borrowed the title of your book, "The End of Telecoms History," from Francis Fukuyama's "The End of History and the Last Man," in which his point was that we've sort of perfected social organisation around liberal democracy, and that turned out to be bollocks.
So
I think I've heard Francis Fukuyama interviewed, and he gets a little bit defensive. He goes, I wasn't quite fucking saying that. I wasn't saying it's all done and dusted and we can all just put our feet up, which is the way it gets characterised. But that's the point. I'm just going to read one paragraph from the back of the book that you've got. So this is your words. Those who are well connected with good home broadband and good mobile coverage have all the connectivity they need. The journey that started with Morse and Marconi has come to an end. It's the end of history for telecoms. We should rejoice that we have all we need, and ensure now that everyone in the world is well connected, which is a very good point, because we're fine. And then you finish off by saying, as one journey ends, another begins. And so that begs a massive question about what that journey is. And then I was just looking, I'll finish reading your own stuff back to you and ask you to comment freely. But as we get to section 4, so sections 1 to 3, you introduce it and you basically talk through a lot of the stuff we've spoken about now. Section 4, you ask, is there anything that could reignite growth? And then you've got a bunch of subsections, which are the sort of, I don't know if you use this word, and it's very hackneyed and I regret using it, but it's convenient, the sort of would-be killer apps.
Yeah.
And, we got all the stuff that we know. We got AR, VR, which we always laugh about. Like, people are going to be walking around, as you said earlier, in the street with fucking Vision Pros on. It's not going to happen. Not least because they cost $1.5 grand. No, $3.5 grand, isn't it? Yeah.
If you walk into a lamppost with one of those on,
you know what I mean?
It's going to be really annoying.
And then you talk about some others that haven't come up, but that are slightly more real, slightly more tangible right now, like digital twins and fixed wireless access and that sort of thing. But, you go, one journey ends and another begins. What in your book do you give us some sense of what this new journey is?
Yeah, so it's ubiquity basically. It's that point that where you've got good coverage and good home broadband, you're fine. But that's not the case everywhere. It's not even the case in London. There's plenty of places where the mobile signal's pretty
this is
crap.
our next section almost.
Yeah, that's true.
But beyond that, there's no end of places in the UK and obviously globally where connectivity is poor for all sorts of reasons. And if you look at most of the surveys that are out there at the moment of sort of what do users want, right at the top of what they want is ubiquity of connectivity. They want to always be connected.
Oh,
so solving that feels like the next problem. And in a way, it's just a matter of cost. We've got the technology to do it. It costs too much to build this.
So that's the other thing about the downsizing of vendors. I mean, I remember, one of the reasons Nokia and Ericsson's numbers are particularly rocky at the moment is they had 1 or 2 quarters of their volumes at least being flattered by Indian 5G rollout. But one thing that was interesting about analysing that is that the cost per unit for, i.e. what they sell the same shit to India for and what they sell it to Verizon for is massively different.
Interesting.
So if they're going to play a part in this, connecting the next billion people or whatever, they're going to have to do it at a much lower margin. And I think Ian, you once wrote, I don't know if you said that you'd got it off someone else, but you were saying how America's basically subsidising everyone else in terms of what they pay.
We both got it off
vendors.
someone else. He was in the pub with us once.
Right. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, and we haven't named them. But
we're not going to name them.
It's a telecoms industry exec. But yes. So
they make all their money in the US. I mean, I think the thesis was that basically they can charge a lot more for the equipment they're selling in the US than... it's like, part of the US operators, I think, spend more on equipment, but they just get charged higher prices.
Yeah, so it's direct from the US consumer. ARPUs are much higher.
It's like buying a Starbucks coffee. It's like $8 in the US now for a latte.
Yeah, you do. I think you do get a higher standard of living in the States, but some of it's slight mirage because you earn more money, but then shit costs more.
Yeah.
And there's all these little taxes.
Anyway,
sales taxes.
Even if you look at the effect on Ericsson and Nokia of when their US sales dip, their North American sales dip, it has their gross margins, and the margins really go down, which tells you kind of what you need to know, I think. Yeah.
And actually for coverage, you don't need the latest, greatest 5G massive MIMO base station. In fact, actually, that's probably not what you want. You want 4G, low frequencies, able to give you quite wide coverage and not too much cost. Yeah. So it's that kind of thing. And I talked about this a bit before as well. I think there's potential for some of these high altitude platforms and similar to actually reduce the cost of coverage in rural areas quite substantially. So I think there's all sorts of things that can be done around that space that means it might not cost quite so much. But that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle, if you like, making sure that there aren't any times where you don't have that 10 megabit connection for your mobile phone.
The India thing that you mentioned, even though the prices are undoubtedly lower, they still did very well out of India last year. I mean, if they'd not had that, they would have been in a terrible state. It's just that the Indians basically decided they were going to build 5G like, tomorrow wasn't going to happen. And
then they stopped spending
so quickly that it's stopped now.
They stopped spending to spend on that bloke's wedding. Did you see that in the news? One of their Ambani kids got married and the wedding took fucking 6 months to play out.
I did read that.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
They were like, I reckon they had those meetings with Ericsson saying, sorry, it's all getting spent on cakes and champagne and doves and shit. And big meringue dresses.
Yeah.
Except no, they don't.
Have you been to an Indian wedding?
I haven't. I imagine
I've been to a wedding in Sri Lanka that was like
the food
several hundred people. It was it was like ridiculous years ago. Yeah.
No, it's true. And I say meringue dressings, but far from it. They've got all these incredibly colourful saris.
It's an amazing experience to go to it. But it is like several hundred people at this wedding, and there were reasonably well-off middle-class people in Sri Lanka that I went to the wedding, got invited, and it was.
But this one's something else. So that's all India's money blown on that.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about your conclusion, like from a journalist's point of view, and this is, William, you and I were chatting a little bit just before, while Ian was enduring his sort of rocky public transport experience. We were talking. I was saying to you, you're someone who's been quite good at saying the emperor's not wearing any clothes over the years. I like to think that me and Ian, even among journalists, are relatively sort of uninhibited at calling bullshit when we see it, while at the same time trying not to fall into that sort of that thing that I don't think it's so guilty of it now. The Register was perhaps guilty of about sort of 10 plus years ago, where everything had to be snarky.
Yeah.
And I think that gets a bit tired after a while. So you try and play each ball on its merits, but also just call bullshit when you see it. And we were just wondering why more people aren't. And one of the conclusions, obviously we can't speak for each individual, but you just get mixed incentives out there. How many people? It's even among analysts, and this isn't in any way to disparage any of my colleagues at Omdia or at Canalis or whatever. But it's the indies, it's people like you, Dean Bubley, John Strand, who tend to be the most strident. Now I understand one part of it is a USP, is a differentiator.
Yeah.
What's the point in being a one-man band analyst if you're coming out with the same charts that Gartner and IDC and all that are coming out with? But I also think that even among analysts, and again, I'm not naming any firms, let alone individuals, you do get some mixed incentives going on because, I can speak for myself. When I was at Strategy Analytics, I think our data was clean, but we always used to get accused of being complementary to Samsung because everyone knew Samsung was a really big client of ours.
Yeah.
This is on the smartphone side when I was there. And from the inside, I can say we were innocent of it. No one ever leant on me and said, why don't you just flatter Samsung a little bit? And we'd sometimes say things. I remember my boss going, we're going to catch hell for this. But I imagine, those kind of pressures are constantly happening on the analyst side. And then, let alone in-house analysts and anyone else who doesn't want to be the one that takes away the punch bowl while the party's still in full swing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And even as an independent, I'm not sure it's actually helpful. So when I finally pushed the publish button on the 5G myth, I turned to my wife and said, I reckon there's a 50-50 chance I just committed professional suicide.
Right. and she was like, "Oh, fucking cheer!"
Yeah, and she said, "That's all right. You can stack shelves in Tesco's then."
Yeah, that's the kind of support you want from your wife, isn't it?
And actually, it's really hard because you can't tell what the counterfactual is. But I suspect I've had less work since because of publishing that. Because in the immediate aftermath, clearly, nobody like Ericsson and Nokia were going to touch me with a barge pole, and the operators, I suspect, also thought, well, he's probably right, but we don't want to be associated with that.
Yeah.
So, and certainly there was a number of conferences where the organizer said, sorry, just can't have you because our sponsors won't have you on the conference.
And do you know what really does my head in about that is in an ideal informational environment, you always want adversarial people.
Yeah.
You always want, I know there are countless examples in the world, like certainly from podcasts I listen to, a lot of academic environments just have groupthink and don't tolerate dissent. And so it's obviously human nature that a lot of us find dissent. We always find it difficult.
Yeah.
If you if you just called out an article that I wrote right now, and you might still, and go, Scott, you were just talking out your arse on that one, I'd find it initially difficult. It'd be a hit on my ego, but I would honestly say for me, I'd be like, all right, because I'd figure I was going to learn something.
Yeah.
And it's from you. It's not just from some rando in the street. It's from someone who's an expert. In fact, I can't remember what it was. I think you had some quite good exchanges on LinkedIn a little while back. You put something up. I remember Gabe from Heavy Reading pushing back. This is all respectfully and professionally.
Yeah,
But you led with your chin with this piece that you put on LinkedIn. I can't remember what it was about. Maybe you can tell me. And then you got a little bit of pushback from a few people. Maybe it was in the context of this.
I think it was Open RAN, actually. I seem to remember it was me saying broadly that the future for Open RAN was looking pretty checkered at this point in time. And I think Gabriel was pushing back a bit on the fact that although the Open RAN vendors may be suffering, they'd actually effectively opened up a new concept, and that thinking.
So Ian wrote recently about Open RAN vendors suffering. Yeah. So anyway, the broader point is, it saddens me that organisations like corporations, like academic setups, whatever, are so resistant. I would have thought that there should be actually a massive market for people like you and Dean to just be the person in the room who's adversarial.
Yeah.
Like Dean always is when we're at events. He's always the one put his hand up saying, hold on a sec.
Yeah. If you don't get anybody challenging you and everything's all rosy and all these buzzwords,
how can you make informed decisions?
Yeah. I mean, that's why short selling's good in a way, because it targets stocks where someone perceives as a weakness.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing really. And if you're right, as you have been with the 5G myth, I mean, how can anybody argue with that now? Everybody's now saying 5G's been a massive disappointment. Yeah. Would anybody put their hands up and say 5G's not been a massive disappointment?
So a lot of it's, I think you touched on it earlier, William, it's a sort of momentum thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going in this direction no matter what some fucking contrarian has to say.
Yeah.
But that's weird in itself. Where does this momentum come from, do you think?
I mean, it comes initially from the desire to make money by perpetuating the world as it is. So
totally.
So if you look,
I agree.
Why did 5G happen? Well, because the vendors assumed that if they could create a new need for the new G, there'd be a whole load of equipment sales. And then they think, well, how do we bring that about? And then they funnel money to academics to do research that sort of favours it and so on.
And the academics know who's paying the bills.
Yeah. And then all that builds up a momentum. And it really picks up when the politicians get involved and start saying, we want this for our country, at which point it's very, very hard for any operator to say, actually, it's not such a great idea. Yeah. Because then that looks like they're being naysayers and, not like the latest technology and so on.
Right. Weeping.
And someone else got a keep here. Someone else just tried to get into the pod studio. I thought we'd locked it.
They don't like my views.
Why is someone trying to get in? I thought it was like
they've obviously started cutting some more keys.
Did you put the schedule?
I still can't get into that Google sheet. Sorry, this is nothing to do with anything. We've got more people because of various corporate shenanigans. There's more people who want to use this studio, and so we've had to set up a little Google.
I didn't even know that anybody else was able to get into this room apart from
you
two.
I'm shocked.
I'm horrified.
I feel violated.
Something about that.
The other guys need to.
Anyway,
but what does interest me is this doesn't appear to be quite so extreme in other industries. So, for example, you get lots of skeptics about AI as well as proponents at the moment, and nobody's kind of shooting them down and saying you can't say AI is bad. It's quite welcome to do that. And driverless cars, whatever, all of those things. There's plenty of people who are on both sides of the argument.
To give Gartner its due, there's always a hype cycle.
Whereas in our industry, it feels like there's very, very little voices speaking up against the perceived wisdom.
Yeah, although the trend, I mean, you look on LinkedIn and you look at Nvidia's share price, and there is still too much positivity, I think. I mean, this is why I like people again like Richard Windsor would be a good example of a kind of skeptic on the AI side of things. I think he's often sort of said this is a bubble and nobody's really making any. It was really interesting actually at a Vodafone event recently. I don't think you were at it, Scott. I think you might be.
It might be when I was in France.
But,
I remember you telling me you had some afters.
We did have some afters. Scott Petty, now they're making a lot of investments and they're talking about Gen AI a lot, but he basically started his whole little, speech to the press before they opened for Q&A by saying we're basically at the peak of the hype cycle, and there's going to be this massive trough of disillusionment. He used those words. And,
it's just Gartner, isn't it?
And it's going to happen because there's just the expectations are too inflated, and the way they want to use it is for things like chatbots and process improvements, but the talk about it changing the world in the way that people make it out is is very there's an element of that maybe, but it's obviously massively exaggerated. There's a huge amount of hyperbole.
Nvidia's only just down from its peaks.
I mean, they talk about Nvidia being worth 50 trillion and stuff like this.
I did see one thing that just came up, I think, on my Google news feed. It was an Irish thing. And that's
bound to be wrong.
Steady. We'll have no xenophobia in this podcast. Apparently, something like a quarter of all Irish electricity consumption is data centers. I read 23.
Okay, maybe it is that now. I happened to pull this because I was doing a bit of work on that, and it's an astonishing amount.
Just data centers.
Just data
centers.
Granted,
they are a particular hub for big tech, aren't they?
They have a lot more data centers per head, but even so, and then if you extrapolate that data centers are going to double or triple their energy usage, you can easily imagine.
Well, I think they were in Ireland. Data centers already use more than, I think the stat was, urban domestic consumption.
Yeah.
That's what the world looks like in a few years' time.
Yeah.
We're all just going to be assimilated by data centers. We're going to be the Borg.
No more parks, just
floating around on the sea in rafts.
So we'll be grateful that they put grass on the roofs of data centers.
Yeah.
That'll be our fun thing. Daddy, why is the grass so warm?
Yeah. On top of which data center do you live?
Data center 1. It's totally Orwellian.
Really
Airstrip 1.
No underfloor heating, though. Free heating. Summers will be tough, though.
So, I mean, there's a tangent that's very adjacent to what we're talking about, but it also is stuff that Ian and I have been writing about. But before I go off on that, William, I'll give you last word. About your book and its findings specifically. Any last thoughts that you want to share with us?
I just to say that it feels, I think, to all of us that it seems like a pretty logical conclusion. it's taking a lot of people a lot of time to get their heads around it. And I think it's almost become such an ingrained belief that data just continues to grow that actually shifting that is going to take a bit of time. So it feels like we're going to need a year or two more for people to just get their minds around this and just gradually change their mindsets.
Or maybe more than a year or two.
Well,
I mean, maybe it won't be until we get to the end of the decade and 6G is a non-starter. Maybe it'll take that long.
I'm wondering, before we get into the next segment a bit, but we were talking about negative read through from this for telcos maybe, and perhaps there isn't any. Perhaps it's a good thing that data just sort of slows down and even goes down. But it's curious, isn't it? Because they make a big fuss at the moment about the data growth, and one of the arguments that gets attached to this is that internet companies and big tech should somehow stump up for network costs, because data traffic's going up so much, and it all comes from about 5 companies, and therefore they should contribute to it. But I'm wondering if we get to the stage where it plateaus or it starts to go down, does it put them in a situation where, for a start, those arguments weaken entirely anyway, but also gigabytes almost become a bit devalued, and we end up in, it becomes quite, they really do start to look in a way a bit more like your, I don't want to use the word because we always kind of use it, but utilities.
Absolutely.
It's still germane. It's still relevant.
They start to look a bit more like it's a dreadful company to compare them to, but someone like Thames Water, which is
I think that's exactly right. They already are to some degree utilities in that. It's very difficult to differentiate the offering between them. It's the same thing. You just buy gigabytes from whoever you fancy buying gigabytes from. In the same way that when you buy electricity, you don't kind of think I'm getting better electricity from that company than from that company. It's just kind of.
Well, in my case, I'm normally buying it off whoever I've defaulted to after the last lot went bankrupt.
Yeah.
I don't know about you. I can't. I've lost track of the last time I actually chose my my energy supplier. Because they all go fucking bankrupt.
Having just moved house.
Right.
I'd kept so pretty much all my utility bills and all of them, I talk about them being rubbish, but they have all done a good job of moving online, and therefore you can keep your account when you move out. You can go, I'm moving out this property. And then I had 3 weeks in between properties, but it's a bit complicated. So we had this gap, which is a bit unusual, I guess. And then just sort of fired it up, and you can, even with Thames Water actually. But Octopus I stuck with.
Yeah. That's so I've defaulted onto.
They're pretty good.
So we're both
they've got a really
now.
good sort of online
We've got
system,
so much in common.
But there has been a bit of a tongue-in-cheek commentary of perhaps the operators will start asking the over-the-top providers to generate more traffic. So there is some growth.
I know. That's what I'm thinking.
That wouldn't happen. But the fair share argument has always been nuts anyway, but I think it just completely falls apart when you don't need to spend more on expanding capacity of the network.
One reason I think of it is because when Scott and I were at this Copenhagen event a few weeks ago, the TM Forum event, there was a panel session in the morning, and the AT&T CTO was on it, Jeremy Legg, and he came out with this interesting comment about how we've moved to this all-you-can-eat world. Good stifling of a sneeze.
No, probably do me damage.
Aneurysm.
But he came out with this comment, we've moved to this all-you-can-eat world, and maybe we need to start thinking, I don't know how he said it exactly, I did write the quote down, but maybe we need to start thinking about usage-based tariffs. And I'm pretty sure he wasn't meaning metering, but a more intelligent way of pricing for data consumption. But if we enter a situation where everybody's basically not using any more, and it's plateaued or it's going down, then that doesn't look like a...
But then you said...
That opportunity they've not taken advantage of is no longer an opportunity either.
It's be like, what should we watch tonight? Ooh, we don't want to watch Avatar. It's 3 hours. That's too much data for today.
I don't think they do it that way.
It'd be like,
you could do it in a slightly...
But that's the really tricky bit, is from where we are now, and you've said this loads of times, they're themselves to blame for having this race to the bottom on pricing and that sort of thing.
You don't want to
from where you are now, if you want to ask me, let's say I pay whatever I pay a month, you ask me to pay more, you can't just fuck around with my bill and make it more expensive, because that'll make me churn just out of a point of principle, won't it? So you got to offer me something tangibly more. You got to go, well, Scott, we want an extra 20 quid a month at you, but look at all this cool shit you'll get in return. Well, and that's the thing we're still really struggling with, is because what is that cool shit?
Well, they're not doing it because there's always going to be someone that doesn't do it, and then everybody doesn't do it, because 3 is always going to go, we're offering you unlimited, yeah? So there's always going to be someone that doesn't do it. I get why they did it, because actually one of the problems I think when 3G came along was that they did try to meter it, didn't they? And then nobody wanted to use internet services because they kind of weren't good enough. And then it became a thing to try and get people online. And while nobody had a 4G connection or 3G connection, you're signing them up, then you're getting growth anyway. But once everybody's online and everybody's not really paying more for more gigabytes, then you're in a bad situation.
Yeah, I mean, my take is I think it's very unlikely they'll get more revenue, but what they can do is reduce their costs. And that's the way to increase profitability, basically. So you keep the tariffs the same, or you maybe even let them decrease slightly, but you push down much harder on the costs. And as we've talked about, one of the key areas is you just spend less on capex because you don't need to roll so much stuff out.
And the other thing is, I suppose, with legacy operators like BT, there's a lot. I mean, they talk about this all the time. But there's a lot they can take out that's in the ground that they don't need to maintain anymore. If they take the copper stuff out, I think Neil McRae, when he was there, he's not there anymore, but it was a chief architect. It was like, we can close down about 4,000 exchanges or something, and
melt
not
it
maintain
and
them.
resell it.
And you can do that as well, actually. Yeah.
And there's some really radical thoughts. But if you look at your fixed line now, you have to pay extra if you want voice on that, because the assumption is that actually you just run over the top systems. Mobile do the same. Basically, you get a data tariff, but you don't get voice because you're going to use WhatsApp or similar. Yeah. But if you do want to use voice, well, it's an extra £3 a month for the voice solution. Yeah. I mean, I could imagine eventually we might move down to a world like that, but that's still some way off.
So I'm the first time ever on a broadband only.
Me too.
Now.
Yeah, I don't have a fixed line.
I don't have a fixed line.
I don't have a phone number.
And I'm the first time ever not with BT as well.
I haven't had a line for years now.
Yeah.
Because I had one, then the phone was not even plugged in. So I realized, maybe I should just...
Well, we realised a while back, me and my wife, that the only person who ever rang up on our landline was her very elderly mum.
Yeah, they just
refused. Just because she hadn't.
Yeah.
But so all we had to do, and loads of spam.
Oh, you're scamming me.
Yeah.
Loads of fucking spam. Yeah, I know. I wonder where those two Venn diagrams overlap. So all we had to do was educate one person, just say, stick to the mobile number now, and then we're good. Listen, before I move on, I meant to bring up your photo. So on the cover of your book, William, you've got a photo where you've got a sort of modern-looking bloke, but talking on an old-school phone handset, but then with what looks like a tablet in his hand. And then you've got what looks like Moses looking at a smartphone. You've got robots, aliens. You seem to have some kind of avatar of death. I'm not sure what that's all about. You've got women in sort of Edwardian lace.
Yeah.
This is when people do a quick Google, William Webb.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just going to be like, William,
what the hell's going on there?
Did you draw that yourself?
I can't draw anything. I mean, so
it's a very good drawing if you did.
No, so this is one of the uses of AI. I literally typed in the end of Telecoms history as a string of words into an AI image generator, and it came up with that, and that immediately.
Awesome. I mean, that is powerful.
Hold on,
isn't
the
it?
business guy in the middle is the same guy as the Neanderthal or the caveman on the.
Yeah, they've only got a few faces.
Same actor.
That's true.
Same model.
And I looked at it and thought, well, I mean, there's probably a few things that I'd change because there's some things in there that are a bit odd, like as you said, the skeleton and God knows what else. But I thought, actually, you know what? It's a lot better than Amazon stock imagery.
The skeleton signifies the end.
Yeah.
I mean, not in a particularly positive way.
Yeah. The one that's the best is the bloke who looks like Socrates using a smartphone.
Yeah. I said Moses.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Either will do.
There's a great at the Ritz in London. There's a great big mural where it's sort of like powdered wigs time, and it's all like these people, and then in the middle there's a guy with a cell phone. Just snuck that in. It's quite funny.
I mean, interestingly, there's a number of discussion strands on LinkedIn, and in the middle of one of them, one guy just commented, "Great book, but the most goddamn awful cover image I've ever seen in my life," which I sort of took a bit of front on because I thought it was moderately entertaining.
That bloke, whoever, you're full of shit, mate. Okay, so very germane to what we were just speaking about is a story that both Ian and I have covered. Mine, I don't know if it's published. I just saved it in the back end before I left the house. Let's see if mine's published yet. Yes.
Saved it in your back end.
Yes, not quite. We never tire of that double entendre, do we, Ian? So actually, I'll read Ian's first because he wrote it first. In fact, it was only because I read Ian's that I wrote the story. So credit where it's due.
Well, I wrote the original one a couple of days ago.
Yeah. So you've done a couple, but the one that I was inspired by was headlined by Ian. 5G from AT&T and Verizon turns out to be Europe level bad, and so I went. My headline was Verizon and AT&T still suck at 5G, which I thought, yeah, That's not very. That's a bit of a casual headline, but then I
love
thought
that,
sometimes.
Verizon and
Well, they'll
AT&T.
hate it.
Yeah.
But that might be just the sort of thing, especially as I'm using American vernacular, which I did again in the body of the piece. Maybe a few more Yanks than average will click on it just because it resonates with them. And anyway, and then Ian had previously written a piece that was published on Monday. Today's Wednesday. It says Verizon 5G network is like cheese full of holes, says analysts, and this is in reference to a bloke called Craig Moffat. And you lent heavily on Craig Moffat in your subsequent story. Now I'll say, and there's Craig Moffat. Obviously, I'm actually not very familiar with him, but you say he's got a very strong reputation. I believe you.
I don't personally know him.
Oh, okay, right.
And I haven't interviewed him even, but I know I think he's in touch with people like Jeff and Mike on the US side of Light Reading, and
he's more equity analyst type of person, is he?
Well, I think so. He's got the company's called Moffat Nathanson Research, and the reports they issue look a bit like equity analyst reports. So,
okay.
And they're on. He was definitely on the earnings call that I tuned into with Hans Vestberg, the famous Hans Vestberg, once of Ericsson.
Yes.
Once of Ericsson, when it basically turned into a shit company.
And now he's with Verizon.
Now he's with Verizon, driving that into the ground.
On which we're going to pass judgment in a minute. Anyway, I thought what was interesting, and this certainly isn't me claiming undue credit, but once I'd clicked through on this is all based. Well, the first two stories, I actually embedded some images. They're quite easy to extract from that report that you linked to.
They're not easy to use in the content management system, are they?
Well, yeah. You just got to not be shit. Anyway, I'll give you a lesson, mate.
Well, I know how to do it. It's just
anyway, so the first two I read out are both that are me and Ian's stories, both derived from this Open Signal report that had a sort of general look at mobile networks in the States, and it covers all sorts of stuff. Like there's one table that look at that. You're onto something. Another one I tried to embed hasn't come through.
Yeah, I told you. Fucking
annoying, that is. I'm going to have to look at that when we're finished. One has come through, but...
He's proven right again.
Yeah, but one came through. Why does one work and not the other? That makes even less sense, doesn't it? And they look at a lot of stuff, and they're sort of quantitative and qualitative comparison of the only three mobile networks that we have in the States. And
we had an Open Signal person on, didn't we?
And we recently had Sylvia on. And the thing that jumped out at both me and Ian and this chap, Moffat, was when you look at 5G.
It jumped out at him. It only jumped out at me because he saw it.
Because he flagged it up.
It's so buried in the Open Signal report. As far as
it is a bit buried, and maybe because I was going to say that even without you and Moffat, that would have been the stark data point to me, and a lot of my conclusions. It's not often that I give myself credit for knowing what I'm talking about, but a lot of my conclusions, I can honestly say, would have been similar to what you and this analyst came up with. And anyway. So the chart shows 5G availability, and it tracks the percentage of the time on average that a subscriber to one of these three networks actually is able to get onto 5G at all. And you got T-Mobile at 67.9, which sounds decent,
it's pretty good,
bordering on good. Yeah. But then you got AT&T at 11.8 and Verizon at 7.7.
So Verizon's has actually gone down apparently as well.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I saw that in your report. And the really interesting thing about it, I mean, the interesting thing about it in the context of what we were just speaking about before, and your book and your general areas of research, William, is, here we are, we're 4 or 5 years into the 5G. We're like halfway through what was supposed to be the 5G upgrade cycle, and two of the biggest and best funded and with the highest number of subscribers, operators in the world, have still got 10% coverage. It's fucking bizarre.
Well, okay, it's slightly different from coverage.
Yeah.
It's not quite the same as coverage.
That's true. No, you're right to be strict about that, because they mean different things.
They even say it doesn't mean geographic coverage.
Yeah, and you're right. They mean different things.
And I think the reason it's because someone wrote to me and went, when I published my first story, and went, is it really that low? Where they got those stats from? And I did look at the open signal methodology, and it's very clear that they spend a lot of their time looking at indoor data, because that's when people mainly use their phones. Now, I can relate to that. You can't get a 5G signal inside my house,
but in a way, it's experience.
Nor inside this building.
You could argue it's experienced coverage. It's the coverage people actually experience.
Well, that's what they go big on. That's actually what Open Signal goes big on. They use a lot of
better
their own
reflection
metrics
of what the user gets. And I think ordinary people don't care about you saying you've got 90% coverage. They care, can I get onto 5G? Maybe they don't, because one thing, when I first went and looked at this availability stat in the Open Signal data, and I was thinking, let's see it firsthand from the original source that Craig Moffat's talking about. And I clicked on availability, and it showed 97%, 96%, and 96% with T-Mobile on 96%. I was like, what's he on about?
But
availability means all mobile. So they're
not just
basically 4G based in America. They've shut down,
and it'll be
3G, haven't they?
Coverage.
They've pretty much shut down 2G, I think now. So they're talking about 4G. And I think even then they meant that would reflect some indoor use, but I guess with 4G, because it's using lower spectrum bands, and they've sort of been investing in it for a lot longer. It all looked quite good, but you go to 5G and all of a sudden it's a lot worse. And I guess the question is, does a consumer really care if they can do everything on 4G that they need to do anyway?
So my suspicion is not. My suspicion is that very few people will get their phone out and say, I was going to browse the internet, but it's only 4G. I'll wait till I'm a bit further down the street and I've got 5G.
I'd rather have 5 bars on 4G than 2 on 5G, I think, when you can't get a...
I think you're both right. I think there's a slight pain point when you're entitled to 5G and you hardly ever get it.
Well, there is a pain point when your CEO's been going with a leading 5G company. Yeah. And that was Craig Moffat's point, is that Verizon's made a big thing about how they're the best 5G network on quality, and yet you can get on it 7.7% of the time.
Can I tell you an even weirder thing about those images? I just refreshed my own page, and now that image that hadn't come up before has come up.
Oh, you're making it up.
What the fuck is going on? No, here it is.
That's the original Open Signal report that you showed me there.
Telecoms written on it. Stop being unhelpful.
So I would argue, actually, those percentages might actually be perfectly sensible, because nobody needs 5G if you've got good 4G. 5G is only really there to handle the capacity requirements, and you probably only need it in the densest areas to pick up the extra traffic that's in those areas. And so as long as it's doing that job, then that's fine. But I think, to your point, the issue is actually the way it's being marketed.
Yeah, expectations.
And the fact that those companies aren't living up to essentially the marketing hype that they themselves chose to use, because they thought consumers would want to have 5G.
And I think the thing that stood out for me is, he's pretty outspoken as an analyst, as you are. He sort of has an opinion, and he sort of put out his report and said he described it as a shocking revelation in the Open Signal data. And then he went
William
on about
doesn't find it so shocking.
I mean, he clearly, the reason that he's obviously drawing this big difference between T-Mobile and the other two is that T-Mobile has relied very much on, I think, quite low band spectrum plus this 2.5 gigahertz stuff. 2.5 gigahertz is a lot lower than what Verizon and AT&T are using, because that's they call it C band, but the C band's actually 3.7 to 4.2, I think.
Oh, right.
And the reason AT&T's is slightly better, by the way, he speculates, is because they picked up some of this 3.45 gigahertz spectrum.
William and I were chatting about this before, and I was asking William about the incremental difference when you get into mid-band between slightly lower and slightly higher frequencies. I mean, there is one, but you don't reckon it's huge.
So if you go from the UK C-band, which is 3.4 to 3.8, which is what the mobile operators here use, I think the difference is about 5% in terms of propagation range
between
3.4 and 3.8.
Yep.
So within a band, it's not that much. But as you rightly say,
so that would translate to that difference.
Yeah, if you jump to 2.1 or even much lower, and actually, I'll have to dig into it, but my suspicion is an awful lot of
we're talking about propagation.
Yeah.
We're talking about range.
Yeah. I think a lot of the T-Mobile coverage is actually down at 700 meg,
700,
which goes a long way.
700, and then using
600.
this...
it is, honestly.
So there's some 600.
600 or 700, but it's also then using the Sprint. The whole rationale for the Sprint takeover, really, as it turned out, was just to get hold of this this spectrum they've been using for WiMAX originally, which is 2.5 gigahertz.
When I was writing this, I did a bit of research. And unless I got this wrong 5 years ago, which is certainly fucking possible. So December the 2nd, 2019, I wrote a story headline, T-Mobile launches America's, quote, first nationwide 5G network, close quote. And this was all based on 600 megahertz spectrum, where I can't remember where it got hold of it.
It was what's called a TV reverse auction that took place in the US, where they got it from the broadcasters. Basically.
Nice one. And so 600 is exceptionally low frequency, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then so that was December 2019, and then I wrote a story September. So that was November, and this is December. I wrote this, still 2019. I wrote a story headlined 5G over low frequency spectrum seems to be a waste of time. And this was based on...
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, this was 5 years. I was cut me some fucking slack. Anyway, let me finish this. The point was what I got there. Oh, yes. This was just something, I suppose, not 100% scientific. PC Magazine had done some initial testing. So let's call this anecdotal rather than
Let
empirical.
me guess, they said it's no faster than it is on 4G.
Yeah.
Well,
more or less. At the time, it was about 20% faster. So the point was, and I'll finish making this point and then you two can rebut it, is it's all very well using low frequency, a small amount, because we typically have a small amount of low frequency spectrum, don't we?
Yeah.
It's all very well using a small amount of low frequency spectrum and calling it 5G, but qualitatively, in practice, is it necessarily any better than that same spectrum, than using that same spectrum for 4G?
So there's an interesting paper that I saw, an academic paper in the States that came out a few months ago, which did quite a lot of drive testing of 4G and 5G networks in the States, and came to the conclusion that actually 5G was not any more spectrally efficient than 4G
We've had this chat
world
before,
deployments. So essentially, with a given amount of bandwidth, you get the same data rates, regardless of whether it's 4G and 5G. Now, the reason why 5G is faster is because the bandwidths are so much greater.
Especially when you get to mid-band.
Yeah, when you get to mid-band.
But that's just because the equipment's been engineered to work in those bands. And clearly, T-Mobile's got equipment that's been engineered to work in 2.5 gigahertz.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of bandwidth there. But if you go down to 600 or 700 megs, then operators have typically got 20 or 30 megahertz of spectrum. And that's about the same as 4G bands as well. So you'll get about the same data rate.
So it's just a spectrum difference.
Correct, it's a spectrum difference.
It's nothing to do with the technology.
No. So in principle, if you just stuck with 4G and shoved it into C-band, you'd be in a pretty similar position.
This is why even more, I think so Moffat's thing on the spectrum stuff, I mean, he pretty much starts by saying, this supports my thesis that I came out with back in 2020, 2021, when the C-band auctions were going on in America, that this spectrum's a waste of money. And what do they spend on it? $100 billion. Verizon spent $45 billion on C-band licenses. I think AT&T, with that and its 3.45 gigahertz, spent about 30. And, then you had more than 30. And then you had T-Mobile going for a little bit, and some other companies, probably Dish.
Oh, mate, and that's before you even get into millimeter wave. I've got a story here.
It just looks like a massive swindle.
I mean, Verizon spent $1.6 billion on millimeter wave.
Well, I mean, the millimeter. So the funny thing I think about Verizon is they've gone from going 5G is all millimeter wave. It's great. This is what it's about. All that lower band stuff's rubbish. Then they've eventually had to accept that millimeter wave is a complete waste of money. Gone down to
apart from certain very high intensity.
Gone down to rolling out C-band, and now it's all about C-band, and we're at 50% on C-band now. Of our traffic's on C-band, up from 36% this time last year, which is where they are basically. It's another reason probably why those stats are what they are, because not everything's running on that.
Yeah.
And now if they've got an analyst going,
you wasted
actually that's too
even
high
that's
as well. That's rubbish.
Yeah.
So and this is the reason I bring up that T-Mobile one. Now we don't know. So this is me writing 4.5 years ago about 600 megahertz. That could have been a stopgap.
Yeah.
And it could be that they've entirely
coverage.
Well, exactly, and this is my ultimate point. When you've got a graph like that one where T-Mobile's coverage is 6 or 7 times better, that many orders of magnitude better, I don't think that's just explained by them using 2.5 versus 3.5. I reckon a lot of that coverage is still on 600.
I think it'll be on 600.
Yeah, maybe.
But the interesting question is actually, what's the user experience across those different networks? So is the average user most of the time getting enough data to do exactly what they want, such that they don't feel data constrained? And actually, I suspect if you pulled that stat, you'd find that the networks all look pretty similar.
They probably do. There was a good graph in Moffat's report, by the way, that Crown Castle did a simulation a few years ago of propagation of a 2.5 gigahertz network compared with the 3.5 gigahertz network. And the 2.5 gigahertz network was substantially better than the 3.5 gigahertz network.
No, don't doubt it.
Now, 2.5 gigahertz is not much higher than you were using for those 3G.
Correct, that was 2.1.
I mean, the thing that I'm like this, shocking revelation, the shocking thing about this to me is that the whole industry worldwide is based on mid-band 3.5 gigahertz spectrum. This whole story's been, this is the sweet spot for 5G. I mean, I went and looked at the Open Signal report for the UK, because you're thinking, well, they've used mid-band spectrum, so what's it like there? So across all 4 operators in the UK, this was a slightly older report. It's like late 2023, so it's not that old. They were on 10%, all of them.
Coverage or
same stat, 5G availability.
Availability,
10%.
And actually, we didn't end up in C-band for 5G because a whole load of engineers sat down and asked themselves, with a blank sheet of paper, where's the perfect place to be? Oh, look, it's C-band. No, that wasn't the situation at all. It was more, oh, right, we need some more spectrum for 5G. Where can we get it? Oh, my God, everything's really congested. Oh, but that's C-band. That's slightly less congested than anywhere else.
And you've got political stuff where they just sort of force broadcast to give some up. And that
Exactly. So it was more the art of the possible than it was that this was some kind of ideal spectrum. In fact, far from it. It's actually, you'd much prefer to be down at, somewhere between 1 and 2 gigahertz. Yeah. Probably the best place if you really could get hold of that.
But no one's written the story saying this whole 3.5 gigahertz 5G story has actually been a bit of a scam. Really.
Emperor's New Clothes, William. That's your next
I mean, their way to solve this problem to me is they're freeing up all this stuff from 3G now, which is 2 gigahertz, let's say 2.1. That would be where to put your 5G
absolutely.
services.
And indeed, some people are starting to do that now to refarm their lower frequencies to some extent into 5G.
Well, I suspect one other conclusion they've come to is, again, consistent with stuff you've been saying, William, that you've been saying on this pod and previously, is that maybe we don't need as much spectrum real estate as we thought. So one of the reasons there was a sort of gold rush to mid-band and even to millimetre wave is there's a fuckload of real estate there. And the reason there is because it's shite. So, it'd be like saying, oh, I've just bought a massive plot of land in the Australian outback. Yeah. Well done, mate. There's a reason why that was cheap and available. And maybe people have realised, God, because of this S-curve and because, things that are plateauing and because of things like Pierre was saying with compression, we don't need as much real estate, which ultimately comes down to the fatness of the pipe, just the sheer amount of data rate that you can do and the capacity.
Yeah.
We just don't need it. So maybe we can have less capacity, but at a much more optimal frequency.
You don't need it if you're getting rid of your 3G service, which everybody's doing now. They're all phasing those out.
They can just refarm.
And there's a lot of spectrum there that you can use, and it has good propagation, and it's that is a real sweet spot. I would say probably that sort of 1800 2000 level. But the question for Ericsson and Nokia is, who are constantly going on about mid-band, and there's not enough mid-band coverage in Europe. I get why you want to sell mid-band equipment because it implies densification, which implies putting more sites.
That's just what I was going to lead up to. Yeah. The only way they're going to get above 10% where they are now is to build a fuckload more.
The real question should be
base stations.
What about engineering your equipment to work on 2.1 gigahertz, let's say, rather than trying to flog this 3.5 gigahertz stuff that turns out to be quite shit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or in fact, actually, just come to the conclusion you just don't need to roll out 5G where you've got good 4G and you've got enough capacity, and just leave things be, basically.
And that's the other little secret. Everyone's kind of known that. Yeah. Everyone's kind of known that 4G. We all appreciated the upgrade from 3G to 4G in terms of mobile data. Anytime, I mean, I had one pod, you may or may not have heard it, but after a few months ago, I went and spent a long weekend in Venice, and slightly tragically was obsessing over who I was roaming to.
Yeah.
And it really flitted around.
That's the worst country in Europe for 5G, I think, Italy. And
they spent all that money on that auction as well. Yeah. Maybe that's it. Well, they spent all their money. And anyway, cut long story short, it varied massively depending on who I roamed to. But even when you go down to HSPA Plus, you're suddenly aware of how slow it is. Just trying to load up BBC Sport website, check the scores or whatever. But 4G, the difference between 4G and 5G, I mean, it is there. 5G is definitely quicker on the whole as a user experience, but it's not a pain point. 4G is all right.
Yeah. It might be quicker, but it's not. It doesn't allow you to do anything you can't do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just a bit quicker. And then we get into increments of Gone with the Wind or whatever people talk about when you're downloading files.
Well, nobody downloads though, do they? People don't download on their phones. They might download on a laptop before they
Well, I do. Do you know what? I download podcasts a lot on my phone.
Weird.
No, but even podcasts, that's audio. So it's a relatively small file. Yeah. I can't imagine trying to download... Like, before I went away for my brother's 50th, I downloaded all the episodes of Band of Brothers onto an iPad so that I could watch them on a plane. It's fucking awesome. I love it so much. I couldn't imagine ever downloading all that. So that's like, 8 hours of video.
Not very uplifting,
done that on mobile.
And even if you
no, it's quite full on. In fact, I had a funny little story. I was sat on aisle right at the front of the plane.
Someone complained about someone's leg being blown off.
Well, almost. No, I kind of preempted it. And so I was at the front of the plane and I realised, here's a little top tip. Don't pay for extra leg room at the front of the plane because then you're right next to when everyone's queuing up for the bog that's next to the cockpit. So I had a lot of that. And one time some geezer was queuing up with his like 5-year-old kid. And the kid was, you know how easily distracted. I was looking over my shoulder and I paused it and I went, look, I'm just pausing it because I'm watching like a war stuff and I don't want to freak your kid out. And he just laughed. He went, oh, nice one, much appreciated. But it's almost like he wasn't that bothered if they had seen that some dismemberment. But anyway, so obviously I wasn't going to download all of those.
And if you did, you'd probably have done it over Wi-Fi anyway. If you decided to download it to your phone, you'd probably have done it at home.
As opposed to 5G or whatever. Yeah. So, but I still think this thing is interesting, this open signal thing that Ian and I have both written about and what this guy Moffat had said before.
I think this opens up like so much coverage, like not coverage for networks, but
so the thing I wonder is
opportunities.
Right.
To what extent the operators are going to change their tune. So there was an interesting blog from the CTO of Virgin Media O2 about 3 weeks ago. And the title was, "We're no longer going to indulge in vanity metrics."
Right.
And yes, I remember someone else brought that up on the pod. Was it Jeannie York?
Yeah.
This came up before.
And basically, she said, "Look, there's been a survey done by this company. I think it's GWS. They tell us that actually what consumers want is coverage everywhere and low prices, and they're not that concerned about speed. And therefore, we're not going to bang on all the time about speed. Instead, we're going to talk about the stuff that they really want to know about." And sort of left it at that. But the implication was, to some degree, we're not going to bang on about 5G or 4G or whatever. We're just going to tell you that wherever you are, you've got the connection that you need. Now, if other operators start to go down that route and start to push that message, then all of this sort of, whether you've got 10% 5G or 20%, fades into the background because it starts to become a network operational issue as opposed to a consumer experience issue.
Yeah, and there was some linkage in the. Because it was an earnings report, they're obviously talking about how they've done recently and calling out their stats and their numbers and how they've grown their customer base. But Verizon's done quite badly compared with AT&T and T-Mobile they break down their consumer metrics in all sorts of ways these days because you've got iPad users, you've got postpaid, you've got prepaid. But the ones that you probably really need to pay attention to, the postpaid phone subscribers, and their customer base has only grown by about 216,000 in the last 3 years, whereas AT&T's up something like 4 million and T-Mobile's up like 6 or 7 million.
Yeah,
I don't think any of that's got anything to do with this 5G issue at all. I just think it's basically T-Mobile's been very canny on marketing, and you're going back to the Jean Leger era with him being a bit of a gobshite, And
I still remember there was a time where O2 in the UK were very spectrum constrained. It was before the sort of some of the earlier 5G and previous auctions, and their network was materially worse at that point than all the others. And yet they were still signing up more subscribers than anyone else. Yeah. And it was because they had special offers to the O2 Arena, all that other kind of stuff.
Totally. Yeah.
It was nothing to do with network experience.
Yeah. So you can get sort of too bogged down in some of these metrics, but I think he makes a really good point that Verizon's gone in hard on we're the best 5G company, and they've got a CEO who's comes from a 5G vendor, very much a 5G vendor. It was a 4G vendor, obviously, when he was there and trying to do other things, but it just makes them look a bit, like they've got things back to front, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right. I'm going to quickly move it on to our last topic. We've only got 20 minutes max left to chat about it. I always like for the last topic where it's it may or may not be a Scott Pacino self-indulgent TM topic, but just take it on a slightly different direction. And I thought this is the big global IT meltdown that we mentioned that was kind of breaking when we did the podcast last Friday, and it's traced to this security software provider called CrowdStrike. And what I think's interesting about it for me has been the sort of blame game, like Pierre earlier when we were chatting about it before we started recording, was that Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at each other. I mean, in one sense, it's not a blame game. Everyone knows it's CrowdStrike's fault. But Microsoft has been on defensive because it obviously only affected Windows machines as opposed to Macs or whatever.
Yeah.
And the sort of supposed blue screen of death is something that, back, William, forgive me for saying so, you're probably old enough to remember like the 80s BSOD.
It used to happen every day or two.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh God, not again.
And I'm certainly old enough to remember that. And anyway, and they've owned up. There was a blog by the CEO of CrowdStrike called George Kurtz, who reminds me of Marlon Brando's character in Apocalypse Now.
It's because they got the same name.
It's Kurtz, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's based. The original is a Joseph Conrad novel, Heart of Darkness.
Oh.
He doesn't look like him at all.
Apocalypse Now is based on a Conrad novel.
I did not know that.
Which is set in the Belgian Congo. It's just
and they've adapted it to Nam.
Yeah.
Ah, cool. Anyway, and he goes, sorry. Yeah, it's all been a big fuck up. We're trying to fix it, and that's all fine. And then there was a bit written by some geezer called David Weston, who's Microsoft's VP of Enterprise and OS Security, going, it's CrowdStrike's fault. So that's fine. We're all agreed it's CrowdStrike's fault. End of chat. Let's move on. But no, because then the reason I wrote about it was I was journalising a Wall Street Journal report that spent the majority of it it seemed to, I wouldn't say it's biased, but it seemed to have an agenda from the start, which was to have a pop at Microsoft. And perhaps rightly so. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but you can tell, certainly as a journalist, the advice a lot of journalists have, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that's the case here, but advice a lot of journalists have is they start with their conclusion, they start with their headline, and then kind of reverse engineer the whole story and cherry pick quotes and anecdotal evidence to support that, which is a real journalistic vice and one that should be resisted. In fact, I had to do that in this story because my headline was Microsoft blames Europe for Windows access that allowed CrowdStrike meltdown, and because I'm a bit biased against the European Commission, just because I think it's a bloated, unaccountable bureaucracy that's self-serving and shit.
The Habsburg Empire.
There we go, just like that. In fact, they're all called Habsburg, the people in charge. So my starting cognitive bias was to have a pop at Europe and go, fucking Europe screwed another thing up.
Wow, beers.
Yeah, well, you can have one of these stars if you need one, but we're only 15 minutes away anyway, mate. But then I got into it and I realised, no, the interesting thing about this was Microsoft's role in all this. And the purpose of the headline was in this Wall Street Journal report. So it was mainly just going, well, this doesn't happen to Apple.
Yeah.
And it's obviously a bit antagonistic to Microsoft. But then right at the end, literally at the end of this, what must have been about 1,000-word report, they fucking write some long reports on the Wall Street Journal. There was a comment from an anonymous Microsoft spokesman, I think they called them.
1,000 words?
The whole report possibly was. They often write real long-ass reports.
1,000's not that long.
I think it is for a journalist. I know it's normal for you. But for me, I'm more like about 500. I'm pushing it. Anyway, I'm not saying it's bad to write it that long. If all 1,000 words are full of juicy content, which yours always are.
Thank you very much.
He said backpedaling rapidly. And this quote from the Microsoft person said, quote, that Microsoft cannot legally wall off its operating system in the same way Apple does. So you can see the defensive tone. And presumably this is one of these things where Wall Street Journal had we're writing this and now it's already done, but we're reaching out to you for comment. So I have some sympathy with these flacks when they're suddenly on the back foot and they got to come up with something. So it cannot legally wall off its operating system in the same way Apple does because of an understanding it reached with the European Commission following a complaint. In 2009, Microsoft agreed it would give makers of security software the same level of access to Windows that Microsoft gets. And then I finished off that paragraph by saying the clear inference being that without that access, this snafu, which is an American term for fuck up, doesn't happen. And I thought it was interesting, and it seemed plausible. And obviously he wouldn't lie. When he's quoting on the record to Wall Street Journal, but then I tried to imagine, because I didn't get round to just fully researching what might have happened in 2009. But what seemed plausible to me is, as I said in the next paragraph, most likely the EC action was in response to the launch of Windows Defender and Microsoft Security Essentials. So you remember back in the 80s, back in the BSOD days, we never had it. You had to go with Norton or McAfee or countless other people. Yeah, Norton I think was the dominant one for a while.
Aren't they?
Yeah. Well, McAfee was a very interesting guy. Didn't he die?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a crook though, wasn't he?
But before he died, well, he's a crook, but he's also just an out there wacky sort of I don't know. I mean, he was all off his tits. He lived in Belize. I mean, he just did all kinds of crazy shit. Anyway, and so it used to just be Norton and McAfee et al. And then Microsoft just suddenly came out with Windows Defender and Microsoft Security Essentials, which I thought was great because it was free.
Yeah.
And I thought, who better to secure Microsoft than Microsoft itself? Which obviously begs the question why the fuck they hadn't done it for the preceding decades, but that's another matter. But then I imagine the EC, the European Commission, in response to a complaint presumably from one of these other vendors, went, okay, what's going on here in a competitive sense? In the same way that they did them in the 80s for bundling, what did they call it? Internet Explorer with Windows.
Yeah.
And ended up saying you can't do that. Yeah. They would have gone, okay, you're obviously a massive competitive advantage over all these other security vendors because your products have got this deep access to the operating system, to the kernel or whatever the geeky word is for this stuff. And they haven't. So they would have gone, you can only keep doing this shit if you let them have the same access you do, which I think is what this Microsoft guy was saying. Now, the thing I find that as a point of mitigation, initially I thought, okay, fair enough. And I was ready to write, fucking Europe, it's all your fault. And I thought, well, no, hold on. Europe's probably right to have made that stipulation because Microsoft can't just come in and just eradicate a whole market and basically abuse its market position. Yeah. So they were right to do that. And then there was some other, there was a tweet. Oh yeah, there was a tweet from their chief FLAC, their chief comms person called Frank X Shaw. I'm not sure
why is it called X.
I know. Who does he think he is? Fucking Malcolm X. And he goes, the WSJ story is a great example of vibe-based journalism. And he goes, moan. And
vibe-based?
Yeah. In other words, he's saying it's not evidence-based. It's just a gut feel-based. I think is what he's inferring. And so he goes on.
It's right.
Well, there we are. I mean, that, especially American press people are the champions at a thing. I don't know if you've heard this, William, FUD, which stands for fear, uncertainty, doubt, fear, uncertainty, doubt, which basically means that you don't directly disagree with something. You just sort of go, well, that wasn't entirely accurate, or they missed important points, or or it was written in bad faith, or whatever, and you just try and undermine something without directly refuting it. And so I think he's doing a bit of that. And he goes, and it's a bit of like what I was talking about earlier, where it's a journalistic vice to start with your premise and then work backwards. Yeah. And he kind of accuses them that. He goes, there's a great example of vibe-based journalism where, based on vibes, it's worth reiterating according to him, reporters decide what to write, then force-fit quotes into the narrative, blinking sheepishly when they end up in conflict. And then he goes and extracts a couple of quotes, and then he goes, all accurate, ! But the headline, blue screens, Google search results, a hasty pivot to security of Windows, even though since it has nothing to do with that, feeble comparisons with no data attached to other OS options, pathetic. And then some other guy who's the CEO. This
is a Microsoft guy who said that.
And he said this on Twitter.
Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately, because of our annoying system, when I try and embed a tweet, I get this.
I mean, that's very rich coming from a Microsoft guy when, you took down like half the planet.
But in his defense, he's trying to say we didn't.
Yeah, well,
he's trying to say CrowdStrike did, and they're only able to because Europe
it's their
forced
fault.
us.
It's not
in fact, I even speculate in my piece that maybe this unnamed spokesperson in the WSJ field piece was in fact Frank Malcolm X.
I mean, it's
Shaw.
a combination of CrowdStrike and Microsoft, isn't it? Because it's like there's a dovetailing between them, and if it weren't for the fact that Microsoft was so monopolistic, then we wouldn't have problems like that.
Yeah, and if Microsoft was better, and my brother made this point when I shared the story with him.
Really powerful.
And if Microsoft was better at its job, we wouldn't need fucking security software in the first place because they wouldn't have these vulnerabilities.
I mean, I thought Colin Bannon, who's BT Business's CTO, put out quite a good LinkedIn comment on it about reliance on cloud platforms and like a few kind of tech players, and we need to sort of think about redundancy and this kind of thing. And it gets back to this whole outage issue that you saw last year with, AWS went down on the East Coast, didn't it? And it was like a few websites to go down for several hours, and Facebook had an outage which caused loads of problems to the kind of small and medium-sized enterprises that like rely on it. And these big platforms are unfortunately pervasive, and if one of them has an issue, then like I think my headline when I wrote it was Microsoft sneezes and world IT catches a cold. Yeah. It's like, it just shows we're kind of overly reliant on a few. And there was a really interesting report long before this, actually, when those Akamai and what's the other one? But Akamai had an issue a few years ago, and there was a really good report by the one of the main banking groups saying
there's a Cloudflare one a little while back.
Yeah, but this banking group basically came out with a thing saying the whole world's banking systems are based on like 3 big players, and if one of them has a tech problem, you can't use systems. There was like the Ofcom's got this study going on to the cloud services market at the moment about dominance there. I mean, it's not like the endings. I'll give the ending away. Yeah. It is skewed towards 3 big players. Yeah. You're going to find that out. And they were going on about this. Gets to the whole point. We talk about this all the time about core networks and whether they should be in the public cloud
and redundancy.
BT, in its statements to Ofcom, specifically goes on about why it doesn't want its networks to be in the public cloud, and it goes on about security and reliability. And okay, BT could have a problem. And it could go down, but they want to be in control of that. And at least if they went down, it's just BT's network. If you've got loads of networks dependent on 3 public clouds, and one of them has a massive outage that affects, as we saw with the CrowdStrike issue, it affects loads and loads of separate organizations. Imagine that with critical infrastructure. Like not being able to even get onto the internet or onto a network.
Well, and that's what really undermines this attempt at mitigation or FUD by Microsoft. So let me read my sort of concluding paragraph, because that sums it up as well as I could off the cuff. So I wrote, so while it's technically accurate to say that CrowdStrike wouldn't have had that level of access to Windows if the European Commission hadn't insisted on it, the apparent alternative would be a Microsoft monopoly of the lucrative cybersecurity market. And this is an aside.
And they could never possibly make the same mistake.
Well, exactly. So
they could never possibly have the same mistake.
Well, exactly. And I was quite measured in my language, but I said, and of course, there's no guarantee that a Microsoft boffin wouldn't at some stage make a similar mistake
just like
to CrowdStrike.
AWS never had an outage last year that brought down loads of websites for it.
And then my final conclusion is that if a Microsoft person fucks up and they got a monopoly, I think they revealed that about 1%, less than 1% of Windows machines were affected by this. Well, if Microsoft had the monopoly, it'd be 100%, wouldn't it? So I don't see how that's great mitigation.
The other thing is that he's also effectively saying, okay, European regulations allowed this to happen, but CrowdStrike can't be trusted with our stuff. So you're going to carry on using CrowdStrike, Microsoft?
Well, does Microsoft use them in inverted commas? I mean, they have to allow them.
CrowdStrike allows it, but they're a client of CrowdStrike, aren't they, presumably?
I don't think it works like that. I think it's if you're a third-party security vendor, because of the EC, you get to embed your security down to the deepest levels of the system. So I don't think there's necessarily a commercial relationship between Microsoft and CrowdStrike, or even a mutual dependency. Just Microsoft has to let CrowdStrike get deep into the guts of it.
The same way that I buy McAfee separately from the fact that I buy
hang
Microsoft,
on a minute.
Plus I'd imagine it's
who's buying from CrowdStrike?
So it would be the IT guys within airports,
CTOs or whatever.
So they buy an update from CrowdStrike that just affects...
they subscribe to the CrowdStrike because they trust them for their security.
Right.
And then CrowdStrike fucked up, and then anyone who was a customer of CrowdStrike got affected, which was less than 1% of all people. So that's how it goes. There's no...
But that less than 1% was still enough to...
Well, exactly. But the point is, without this, why would you buy CrowdStrike security over Microsoft security if CrowdStrike had a more superficial level of access to Windows and thus was able to offer you an inferior security service? So the only reason there is competition is because Microsoft has to allow people into the guts of what they do. And then the flip side is sometimes they're going to fuck up, which is what happened. But then if they don't allow that, then everyone's got to use Microsoft security. And if they fuck up, can you imagine the whole world's, like 100% of the world's Windows machines going down? I mean, that really would have been. We would have been clubbing each other over the head and rooting through the garbage and stuff.
Yeah, but that's
It'd been apocalyptic.
But yes, but that's the problem, isn't it? What you've just said, like, that could never possibly happen. There's only 3 big, like, cloud companies that serve 70% of the world's market. Microsoft being one of them, Amazon, Google being the other 2. If any of those companies failed, like had some catastrophic failure, then things would have been... I mean, this wasn't the big...
It wasn't all that.
Internet
it seemed like a bigger deal, and then it soon...
It's the biggest so far. They're getting bigger. Each one's been successively worse. It started off with like a company called Fastly, I think. Then it's Akamai. Then it's AWS having an outage on the East Coast. Then there's this one where you wake up in the morning and lots of things aren't working, including, by the way, companies that we know in the UK, sending out updates and saying, we don't have certain systems working.
It really affected travel. I think Delta had to cancel like 5,000 flights,
and that's on only 8 million machines. Like, one of these companies could have, like, people said before the 2008 financial crash, there's no way these organisations are going to get out of business. Like Lehman Brothers, can't possibly happen. But
it did. Yeah,
but it does. And
no, you can never write off these. You
can't assume that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google will necessarily be around forever, or that something
some are bailed out
to one of them.
Well, they're bailed out. Yeah, there we go.
People are prepared to bail out banks. Are they going to be prepared to bail out hyperscalers? Probably they are, but
it's not a matter of bailing them out in that case because
the damage is already done.
Yeah. I'll put a slightly lighter note, unless you've got any last thoughts on that last thing we were banging on about, William.
It's a really difficult one. My take as an engineer is these sort of failures are inevitable. This stuff is just so bloody complicated. I'm actually surprised it doesn't happen more often. Yeah. And if you really want to protect against them, your only real way to do that is to have a completely separate backup option, essentially.
Redundancy. Yeah, totally. I agree.
So you have an Apple Mac sat alongside your PC,
right?
And both
which
running
is incredibly expensive.
Yeah, both linked to the same cloud service. They've got access to the same files, and your PC doesn't boot up. So instead, you turn to the Apple Mac and boot that up. But as you said, that's very expensive to do to dual everything.
And we know how redundancy works over time. When a CFO is looking for efficiencies, they'll go, "Do we really need that?" Yeah. Extra redundancy in there that we never fucking use. Yeah. It's a similar concept to insurance, isn't it? One is always tempted to scrimp on insurance because 99% of the time you never cash it in.
Yeah. Or safety measures, ask Boeing.
Yes, well, there we are. Yeah. Do we need to worry about that door flying off? Nah, it'll be all right.
Be right. You can usually land it even without a few windows.
So, how many bolts does it really need?
Do you know what I mean? You can imagine the CFO going, this is the amount of money we saved on bolts this year. In a bean countery way. Yeah. So just a final, more upbeat thought before we call it a day. Podcast guest and friend of ours, industry friend of ours, Charlie Ashton, put up something on LinkedIn where he had a picture of like a smart fridge, like some Samsung smart fridge, with a big screen on it, and the screen had a blue screen of death on it, and he just went, feel for all those people who can't, get a beer or milk or something, and he was being half comical, but the non-comical point he was making is when everything's connected, that's kind of the point Ian was making, when everything's connected and something else happens, the more connected things are, the more fucked we are.
Which is why actually I think it's one of the key reasons why smart homes have never taken off. Would you really trust your front door lock to be only working from your mobile phone and only through a cloud server? Or would you actually like to have a key in your pocket that you can always open the door
Just something that isn't dependent on electricity or IT or whatever.
My one experience of the Microsoft CrowdStrike, because I know Microsoft's going to deny responsibility.
But it manifested itself through Microsoft.
But I was going to Tesco's that day, because I think it was the day we did the podcast, to get my beers.
And you had to pay with
and
cash.
they went, "Oh, you got to pay with cash because our systems are down." And it's like,
and you felt vindicated.
IT system, and I was like, "Oh my god!"
You took a huge word.
Yeah.
When
Ian's long felt embittered about cashless payments, and you were right. I mean, I agree with you. But you felt vindicated at that moment, I bet. And
I said to the Tesco's, "I told you, I've been telling you this all along."
If it's down to you, we'd still be bartering. We'd be like offering someone a goat for some beers. All right, man. William, I know you got stuff to do. And, we've got to have some sharpeners before we meet Nokia.
Yep.
So we'll wrap it up there. Great to see you again. So to remind everyone one more time, presumably William Webb, The End of Telecoms History is available on Amazon.
It is indeed.
Yeah. It's quite thin, so I would recommend it because I suspect it's quite a tightly written, concise, because if you actually look at the contents, you cover a fuck of a lot of stuff. So you must have written it in quite a efficient way. And so, I'd recommend it. I mean, you've only got to get through 100 or so pages.
Yeah, it's should be an easy read on an airplane trip or a train that doesn't go anywhere for a while.
I think it's a bog book.
It's like Heart of Darkness.
Yeah. It's one of the ones you keep alongside your Garfields and stuff. There we are. I should be in marketing, shouldn't I? Really? Yes, on that sleazy note. So now we'll have a bit of a gap. We're going to have one more, which is going to be a week on Friday, and that'll be our last one for about a month.
Is there a guest on that one?
We do have a guest, but I never pre-announce them in case something goes to Pete Tong.
I can't remember who it is.
Yeah. All right, so I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. Make sure you join us for that one.